I remember the way the twin suns felt on the back of my neck that first morning. I understood what it meant to be born here. Not the heat itself, You grow numb to that before your 5th year, But the weight of it. The way it pressed down on your shoulders, like a hand you could never shrug off, reminding you with every breath that this world did not want you here, had never wanted anyone here, and would outlast every desperate attempt we made to prove otherwise. I was 12 years old, standing in the moisture farm's main courtyard, while my father checked the vaporators for the 3rd time that week, and I realized that the sand beneath my boots was older than the Republic itself, that it had buried civilizations before ours, and would bury ours too, and that every single person I knew was engaged in a silent war against a planet that had already won. The smell is what stays with you longest. Not the heat mirages that dance on the horizon during the burning hours, not even the taste of grit that works its way into every meal, no matter how carefully you seal the container saw. It's the smell of evaporated moisture, of machinery run too hot for too long, of lubricant baking onto metal surfaces until it becomes a kind of permanent resin that you scrape away with dull tools while your hands bleed through a glove. That smell meant survival. It meant the vaporators were running, that tonight there would be enough water to drink and mabbi if the yield was good, if the sandstorm season held off, if the jaws hadn't stripped your perimeter units again, enough to sell to the moisture broker who came through from Anchorhead once a week with prices that dropped every season and a smile that never reached his eyes. My father never told me he loved me, not in words, but he taught me how to repair a evaporator condenser in the dark, working by feel alone when the twin suns finally set and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour and your fingers cramped around the tools. He taught me how to read the morning sky for the particular yellow-gray that meant a moisture front was moving in from the dune sea, how to calculate water ratios so that we kept enough back for the hydroponics bay, even when selling everything would have bought us 3 months of food instead of 2. He taught me that love on Tatooine looked like maintenance, like preventive repairs, like checking the seals on the moisture collection tanks before you checked on your own children, because if those seals failed, your children would die anyway. That was the arithmetic of our lives. Every decision reduced to water and time, and there was never enough of either. The homestead where I grew up was 3 kilometers south of the Judeland Wastes, far enough from Mos Eisley that we rarely saw the spaceport traffic, but close enough that on clear nights you could see the glow of the cantinas and the landing bays on the northern horizon, a smear of amber light that represented everything we were not, everything we could not afford to be. Travelers, people who left. We grew up watching ships cut silver lines across the stars, and we learned not to wish, because wishing was another luxury like water, like shade, like the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Our homestead was a warren of underground rooms carved into the sandstone, cool and dark and smelling perpetually of machine oil and human sweat, connected by tunnels barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Above ground, only the evaporator saw 37 of them in a scattered perimeter when I was young, 21 by the time I was 16-18. The landing pad that we used maybe once a year when the agricultural inspector came through to verify our production numbers for imperial records. The Empire. I should speak about the Empire, because people who were not from worlds like Tatooine often think the Empire mattered to us, that we had opinions about the Emperor, or the Senate's dissolution, or the military buildup that everyone said was happening in the core worlds. But the Empire was a distant thing, a bureaucratic entity that existed in triplicate forms and tax assessments, and the occasional star destroyer that hung in orbit like a dagger for a few hours before moving on to somewhere that actually mattered. The Empire did not garrison Tatooine. Why would they waste troops on a planet with no resources, no strategic value, no population worth controlling? They left us to the Hutts, and the Hutts left us alone as long as we paid the water taxes and stayed out of the slave trade's way. That was the real government here. The crime syndicates, the moisture cartels, the unspoken agreements about which routes you could travel, and which areas belonged to the Tuscans, and which belonged to no one, because even the Sand people knew some places were too dead to claim. I learned to shoot when I was 8 years old. Not because we were violent people, not because my father enjoyed weapons, but because the Tuscans raided farms twice a year like clockwork, during the sandstorm seasons, when visibility dropped to nothing, and you could lose a vaporator array in an afternoon if you didn't defend it. My father gave me an old DH-17 blaster that kicked hard enough to bruise my shoulder for days after practice, and he took me out to the perimeter where the vaporators hummed their eternal hymn to futility. And he showed me how to brace against the kick, how to acquire a target through the scope when the air was dancing with heat, how to lead a moving shape because Tuscans never stood still. He told me that killing was a maintenance task like any other, that you did it not out of hate, but out of necessity, that the Tuscans were doing the same arithmetic we were, survival minus resources equals violence sought, and that if our positions were reversed, we would raid their camps just as they raided ours. Then he made me clean the blaster until I could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded, until the smell of Tabana gas and scorched metal became as familiar as my own name. The first time I killed someone, I was 14, a Tuscan, during a raid that came at dawn when the light was still gray and uncertain. I was on watch. I took the dawn shift because it meant I could sleep through the worst heat of the afternoon, and I saw the shapes moving between the vaporators, hunched and purposeful, carrying Gatorade sticks and what looked like a portable moisture rig they'd cobbled together from stolen parts. I triggered the perimeter alarm, a low wail that echoed across the sand, and brought my father and my older brother scrambling from the underground shelter with their rifles. And then I sighted down the scope of the DH-17, and I fired. The Tuscan dropped. Just dropped, like something with its strings cut. I remember being surprised at how simple it was, how mechanical. Pull trigger, absorb recoil, watch target, fall. Then the others were scattering, and my father and brother were firing too, and then it was over, and there were 2 dead Tuscans on the sand, and we were dragging them away from the vaporators before the smell got worse. We didn't bury them. You don't waste that kind of effort on Tatooine. We dragged them half a kilometer out, and left them for the scavengers in the sand, and by evening there was nothing left but stains and scraps of cloth, and by the next morning even those were gone. My father clapped me on the shoulder that night, said I'd done well, said I was a man now, that I'd protected the homestead, that he was proud. I waited for some feeling to arriving, guilt, triumph, horror, anything, but there was only a kind of flatness, a sense that I had crossed a threshold I hadn't known existed, and found nothing on the other side, but more sand, more heat, more maintenance. That was the lesson Tatooine taught everyone eventually, that the universe does not care about your thresholds, your moral boundaries, your carefully constructed sense of who you are. The universe cares about water and entropy, and you are an inefficiency it is constantly trying to correct. We had neighbors, scattered across the plateau like dice thrown by a careless god. The Jensens 2 kilometers to the east, the Lars family, 3 kilometers south, a Rhodian couple whose names I never learned 5 kilometers west toward the wastes. We saw each other maybe once a month, during the moisture brokers' visits when we'd all converge on the trading post at Anchorhead to sell our yields and buy supplies. We were not friends. Friendship requires surplus, leisure, the ability to waste time on someone else's problems, and we had none of those things. But we were allies in the way people drowning together are allies, reaching for the same piece of driftwood, knowing that only some of us would make it, and that there was no point in discussing which ones. We traded information, which vaporator models were failing fastest, which Jawa clans were most aggressive, which routes the hut patrols were favoring gaunt, and then we went home to our separate hells, and tried to extract one more day of survival from machines that were older than we were. The Lars family. I should talk about the Lars family, because they were the last people I spoke to before I understood that leaving was the only form of survival that mattered. Owen Lars was a solid man, taciturn in the way of people who have learned that words change nothing. His wife, Biru, was the only person I ever met on Tatooine who seemed to believe that kindness was not a waste of resources, that offering a stranger a cup of water was not the same as cutting your own throat. They had a boy living with them, No, theirs. A nephew or something. A blonde kid with his head full of clouds and his eyes always on the sky. Luke, I think his name was. He used to talk about leaving, about the academy, about becoming a pilot, and seeing the core worlds and all the places that existed beyond the binary sunset. I thought he was a fool. We all did. The galaxy had no use for moisture farmers' sons, no matter how good they were with a speeder or a flight stick. The galaxy was built on the backs of people like us, and it did not offer rewards for that service. It offered the privilege of continued exploitation, and when you broke down completely, it replaced you with someone younger and more desperate. But the boys' dreams bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate, because they suggested that there was an alternative, that the equation could be solved differently. I was 19 then, old enough to understand that the homestead was failing, that the vaporators were running at 60% efficiency and dropping every year, that the aquifer we tapped was drying up, and the moisture fronts were coming less frequently, that we were in a slow race between our equipment failing, and either way we were going to lose. My father's hands had started shaking that year, a tremor he tried to hide but couldn't. Not when he was holding delicate tools or threading condensers. My brother had left 2 years earlier, signed on with a cargo hauler that came through Mos Eisley, sent us one message saying he'd made it to the core worlds and then nothing, and we understood that he had done the math and subtracted himself from the equation to give the rest of us a better chance. That was love on Tatooine, leaving so others could stay. The hydroponics bay was my mother's domain, though I rarely speak about my mother because she died when I was 6, and my memories of her are fragments, sense impressions, the feeling of cool hands on my forehead when I had fever, a voice singing something in a language I didn't recognize. The bay was a small underground chamber lined with grow lights that hummed a slightly higher pitch than the vaporators, racks of moisture-hungry plants that we grew not for food came in shipments from off-world, compressed ration bars that tasted like recycled plastic, but for the psychological necessity of seeing something green, something alive, something that wasn't sand or stone or metal. We grew Jawa turnips mostly, tough, fibrous vegetables that could tolerate temperature fluctuations and water scarcity, and a few ornamental plants my mother had planted before she died, some kind of succulent with thick leaves and tiny white flowers that bloomed once a year and filled the bay with a scent like honey and old paper. My father never removed those plants even after she was gone, even when the water they consumed could have bought us an extra week of supplies. He maintained them the way he maintained the vaporators, methodically, without comment, as if the act itself was a form of remembering that did not require words. The binary sunset duo. Everyone who's heard of Tatooine knows about the binary sunset, the twin suns sinking toward the horizon in tandem, painting the sky in shades of orange and amber and red, like a wound opening across the heavens. Tourists who passed through Mos Eisley on their way to somewhere else would stop to take holos, would marvel at the beauty of it, would call it romantic or awe-inspiring or spiritual. They did not understand that beauty on Tatooine was a function of distance, that the sunset was lovely precisely because it meant the heat was ending, that you had survived another day, that the temperature would drop enough for you to work outside without cooking inside your own skin. The sunset meant relief. It meant the burn hours were over. It meant you could check the vaporators without gloves, could breathe without feeling like you were inhaling molten glass. The beauty was incidental. The beauty was a side effect of atmospheric refraction and dust particles, and the specific angle of light through a desert air, and we did not have the luxury of appreciating it for its own sake. I think about the water brokers more than I should, about the economic machinery that kept us locked in place. The brokers, usually humans, sometimes Duro or Sullistans, always sharp-eyed and calculate in awe, would arrive in battered transports, buy our moisture at rates they set, sell it to the spaceports and the settlements at rates we never saw. And the margin between those two numbers was where our lives disappeared. We could not sell direct to Mos Eisley. The huts controlled distribution, and if you tried to bypass the brokers, you'd find your evaporators sabotaged, your transport routes blocked. Your family offered exciting opportunities in the slave markets. So we sold at their price, and we bought supplies at their markup, and the gap between input and output narrowed every year. and we worked harder and longer to stay in the same place. Like running on a treadmill, someone kept tilting steeper. That was the invisible machinery of the Outer Rim. Not the Empire, not the military, but the economic structures that made certain planets into resource extraction sites, and certain people into the organic components of that extraction. And if you died, someone else would take your place, because there was always someone more desperate, always someone with fewer options. The Jawas were a constant presence, a moving frustration. You'd wake up and find that one of your perimeter vaporators had been stripped overnight, the condenser coils gone, the wiring harvested, the casing left as a hollow shell that mocked you with its uselessness. The Jawas traveled in sand crawlers, massive tracked vehicles that rumbled across the desert like small cities, and they made their living scavenging whatever wasn't nailed down, and sometimes things that were. They spoke in a rapid, chittering language that sounded like machinery breaking, and they smelled like motor oil, and ozone, and something organic that had gone sour. We needed them all. They were the only source for spare parts, for replacement components, for the ancient technology that kept our farms running. But we hated needing them, hated the way they'd squat in front of their merchandise and name prices that bore no relationship to value, hated the way they knew we had no choice but to pay. My father used to say that the Jawas were the only honest beings on Tatooine, because they didn't pretend the transaction was anything other than robbery, didn't dress it up in paperwork or regulations or market forces. They took what they could carry, they sold what they could sell, and if you died because your vaporators failed, that was simply more merchandise for next season. When I was 17, a ship crashed in the wastes. Not an unusual event. Ships failed regularly in Tatooine's orbit. Navigation errors or drive malfunctions or pirate attacks that left crippled vessels limping toward the surface. But this one was close enough that we saw it come down, saw the trail of smoke and fire as it tore through the atmosphere and impacted somewhere in the deep desert. My father and I took the land speeder and went to investigate, not out of altruism, but because crashed ships meant salvage, meant components and supplies that might be worth the risk of Tusken territory. We found it 6 hours later, a light freighter that had sheared in half on impact, the forward section buried in a dune, and the aft section scattered across half a kilometer of sand. There were no survivors. Had been no survivors, possibly for days before we arrived. The bodies were already mummified, the dry heat and lack of moisture preserving them in twisted poses of final agony. We searched the wreckage anyway, found a few intact power cells, some navigation components, a crate of medical supplies that the sand hadn't gotten to yet. Also found a data pad with a family holo on the screen. 2 adults and a child, smiling in front of some ocean I didn't recognize, water stretching to the horizon in a blue expanse that looked photoshopped, unreal. I stared at that holo for longer than I should have, trying to understand what sequence of choices had brought these people from a world with oceans to a grave in the dune sea. What failures of judgment or circumstance had intersected to put them in a malfunctioning ship above a planet that killed without malice or even awareness. My father took the data pad from my hands and smashed it against a rock. "Oh," said, "we didn't have room for that kind of weight." Said the dead were dead, and their stories didn't matter, that salvage was salvage, and sentiment was a luxury. Then he loaded the supplies onto the land speeder and we drove home, and we never spoke about it again. But I kept seeing that holo in my mind, kept wondering if somewhere in the galaxy, someone was waiting for a message that would never arrive. If somewhere there was an empty house with toys scattered on the floor, and meals uneaten, and a growing understanding that the silence meant death. That was what the Outer Rim did to people. It erased you, made you into absence, and the galaxy did not pause or notice because people disappeared every day, every hour, into the margins and the waste places, and the machinery of civilization continued without interruption. The sandstorms were another constant, another tax on survival. They came in 2 varieties. The small ones that lasted a few hours and reduced visibility to arm's length, and the large ones that lasted days and buried everything, that turned the sky the color of dried blood and howled with a voice like tearing metal. During a major storm, you sealed the underground levels and you waited, listening to the sand hiss against the blast doors like an animal trying to get in. feeling the homestead shake with each gust, knowing that above you the vaporators were taking damage you couldn't prevent and couldn't afford. After the storm passed, you'd emerge to find the landscape rearranged, dunes where there had been flat ground where there had been dunes. Equipment buried or exposed, or simply gone, carried away by winds that could strip flesh from bone. You'd dig out what you could find, repair what you could reach, and write off the rest as acceptable losses in a war you were always losing. The storms taught patience and futility in equal measure. They taught you that the planet was not a stable platform for human life, that we were tolerated here only in the sense that the desert tolerated anything cack, be ignoring it until it died. I think the isolation was the worst part, worse than the heat, or the poverty, or the constant knowledge that machinery failure equaled death. We had communication equipment, a long-range transceiver that could theoretically reach Mos Eisley or even orbit, but using it cost money. Transmission fees payable to the hut's communication network. And what was there to say? Help never came, not for moisture farmers, not for people whose value to the galactic economy could be measured in liters and calculated in quarterly reports. We existed in pockets of silence, scattered across the desert, close enough to see lights from neighboring homesteads on clear nights, but far enough that those lights might as well have been stars for all the connection they represented. When my brother left, when he sent that one message, and then vanished into the core world's anonymity, I felt something like envy so sharp it was indistinguishable from hate. He had escaped. He had solved the equation by removing himself from it, had traded certain death by sand and heat for uncertain death by 1,000 other means. And even if he died in some spaceport's lower levels, or some industrial accident or some war that the Empire was fighting in regions I couldn't name, at least he would die somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't here. My father started coughing that year, a dry hack that echoed through the underground tunnels and grew worse as the months progressed. Silicosis, probably. The fine sand got into your lungs no matter how carefully you filtered the air, accumulated in the tissue over years and decades until breathing became an exercise in drowning on dry land. He refused to see a doctor, partly because doctors cost money we didn't have, and partly because he knew what they would say. Leave Tatooine, get to a world with real medical facilities, undergo treatment that would cost more than the homestead was worth. He knew the math. He'd been doing that math his entire life. Treatment meant selling everything, meant abandoning the farm, meant becoming refugees in a galaxy that had no use for unskilled labor from the outer rim. So he kept working, kept maintaining the vaporators, kept checking seals and replacing filters and calculating water ratios, and the cough got worse, and I pretended not to notice the blood on his sleeve when he thought I wasn't looking. The hut pleasure barges passed overhead sometimes, flying low enough that you could see the lights and hear the music. Massive sail barges loaded with criminals and sycophants and slaves, heading to or from Jabba's palace for entertainments I didn't want to imagine. They represented a different kind of power than the Empire, more personal and more cruel, the kind of power that took pleasure in the suffering it caused rather than administering it bureaucratically. The Empire might kill you with a form, with a tax assessment or a trade regulation or a military action, reduced to strategic objectives and acceptable casualties. The huts killed you with intent, with awareness, because your pain amused them, or served their purposes, or simply because they could, and you couldn't stop them. We stayed away from Mos Eisley for that reason, avoided the cantinas and the spaceport and anywhere the hut syndicates had a visible presence. Because to be noticed by that kind of power was to become consumed by it, to wake up one day with a bomb collar around your neck, and a debt you could never repay, and a death that would come slowly and entertainingly. I met a girl once, during a supply run to Anchorhead. She worked at the trading post, running accounts and managing inventory for the moisture broker, and she had dark eyes and efficient hands, and a way of moving that suggested she was counting seconds, calculating time, always aware of how much life she was spending, and what she was getting in return. We talked while my father negotiated prices and loaded supplies, talked about nothing important on weather, vaporator models, the price fluctuations that were crushing farmers across the sector. She told me she was saving money, planning to buy passage off-world, wanted to get to the core worlds, or maybe the mid-rim. Anywhere that wasn't Tatooine. Said she'd been saving for 3 years, and had almost enough for a ticket and bribes, and the various fees that made leaving possible for people like us. I asked what she'd do when she got there, what skills she had that would translate to worlds where moisture farming wasn't the primary occupation. She smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes, and said she'd figure it out, that anything was better than staying, that she'd rather die trying to leave than die here knowing she'd never tried. I never saw her again. The next time we went to Anchorhead, someone else was running the accounts, a Celestin with mechanical efficiency and no interest in conversation. I asked about the girl, casual, like I didn't care. The broker shrugged, said she'd quit, said he didn't know where she went. Maybe she made it off-world. Maybe she got the money together and bought passage and escaped into the vast anonymity of the galaxy, found work and life and possibility on some world where water fell from the sky and people didn't count their drinks in milliliters. Maybe she died trying, ran into pirates or slavers or imperial entanglements, became another disappeared person whose absence no one remarked on. Maybe she's still on Tatooine, working some other desperate job, her savings stolen or spent or simply insufficient, the dream of leaving receding like the horizon, always visible and never reachable. I think about her more than I should, about the mathematics of escape, about how many people calculate that same equation and how few solve it correctly. The rebels came through once, a cell operating in the Outer Rim, hiding from Imperial patrols and looking for supplies, for shelter, for any help the local population could provide. They landed at our homestead after dark, 3 of them in a battered ship that looked like it had been patched with prayers and spite, and they asked if we could spare water and food, offered to pay in credits that were probably worthless. My father told them no, told them to leave, said we couldn't afford to be associated with enemies of the Empire, that we had enough problems without adding treason to the list. They left without argument, disappeared back into the darkness, and I remember standing in the courtyard and watching their ship climb into the stars and wondering if they were brave or stupid, or if there was any difference on a long enough timeline. The rebellion was a story we heard sometimes, a rumor that someone somewhere was fighting back against the Empire's expansion, but it was abstract, distant, irrelevant to our daily survival. You could not rebel against the twin suns. You could not organize a resistance movement against silicosis and equipment failure and economic structures that turned people into extractable resources. The rebellion fought for something called freedom, but freedom was another luxury good, available only to people who had already solved the equation of survival, and we were still working on the fundamentals. My father died on a morning that started like every other morning. He went out to check the vaporators, routine maintenance, and he didn't come back. I found him an hour later, collapsed between 2 condensers, the sand around him stained with blood he'd coughed up, his tools still in his hands. He'd been trying to tighten a seal, I think, or maybe replace a filter in something small, something routine. The kind of repair he'd done 10,000 times. The heat had killed him as much as the disease. The combination of damaged lungs and burning air, and the simple accumulated exhaustion of a life spent fighting a planet that could not be defeated. I carried him back to the homestead, underground to the cool darkness, and I realized I didn't know the proper procedures for death on Tatooine. Didn't know if you were supposed to bury people or burn them or simply leave them in the sand. I wrapped him in spare cloth and took him out to the edge of our property and buried him in a shallow grave that the first major sandstorm would probably uncover. And I marked the spot with a piece of scrap metal because I couldn't afford a proper marker, and because nothing on this planet was permanent anyway. After that, I was alone. The homestead was mine now, all 37 vaporators in various states of failure. All the maintenance schedules and water calculations and negotiations with brokers who cared nothing for my father's death, because death was not their problem. Supply and demand was their problem, and I was just another component in the machinery of extraction. I kept working because stopping meant dying, and because I didn't know what else to do, because the alternative was to walk into the desert and keep walking until the heat and the dehydration took me, and I wasn't quite ready for that particular solution. I maintained the vaporators, I checked the seals, I calculated water ratios. I did everything my father had taught me, and the homestead continued to fail because the aquifer was drying up and the equipment was aging past the point of repair. And I was one person trying to do the work of three. The loneliness was a physical thing, a pressure in the chest that made breathing difficult. I would go days without speaking, weeks without seeing another person, except the moisture broker during his weekly visits. And the silence accumulated like sand, buried me in layers of absence and isolation. I started talking to myself, narrating my actions as I worked, checking condenser 3, replacing filter on unit 17, calculating today's yielded, just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. I started seeing shapes in the heat mirages, people who weren't there, ships that never landed. I started understanding how this planet drove people mad, how the combination of isolation and heat and hopelessness could erode sanity the way wind eroded stone, slowly and inevitably and without malice. I lasted 8 months alone before I accepted that I was not going to make it, that the equation had no solution, that I was watching my own death in slow motion and could do nothing to prevent it. The vaporators were failing faster than I could repair them. The water yield had dropped to 30% of what it had been when my father was alive. The moisture broker had stopped coming, had written off our sector as unprofitable, and I had no way to sell what little water I was producing. I was running out of food, out of spare parts, out of reasons to continue. The homestead was going to kill me the way it had killed my father, the way it had killed or broken or driven away everyone who had ever tried to make a life in this emptiness, and I could either accept that death, or I could try the other equation, the one my brother had solved, the one that girl at the trading post had attempted. I could leave. Oh wow. The idea was terrifying in a way that dying was not, because dying was at least familiar, expected, a known quantity. Leaving meant walking away from the only life I knew, abandoning the homestead that my father had died maintaining, admitting that all the years of work and sacrifice and maintenance had been for nothing, that we had lost the war against the sand. But the alternative was to die here, to become another pile of bones that the scavengers would pick clean and the sandstorms would bury. And I found that I was not quite ready to accept that ending. Not yet. Not when there was still a possibility, however remote, that somewhere in the galaxy there existed a place where water fell from the sky, and people didn't count their survival in liters. I sold everything. The vaporators sold to a Jawa clan for a fraction of their value. The homestead itself sold to a developer who was buying up failed farms for reasons I didn't ask about. The equipment, the tools, the supplies, everything that could be converted to credits. I kept back enough for passage off-world and bribes and fees, and I walked away from the homestead on a morning when the twin suns were just clearing the horizon, and the heat was building like a physical force, and I did not look back, because looking back meant acknowledging what I was abandoning, meant confronting the weight of everything that had been sacrificed to keep that pile of machinery and sand operational. I bought passage on a transport leaving from Mos Eisley, a cargo hauler that took passengers, if they didn't mind traveling in the hold with the freight. The spaceport was chaos, a tangle of languages and species and smells that overwhelmed my desert-adapted senses. Cantinas bleeding music and violence into the streets, stormtroopers on patrol looking bored and dangerous, HUD enforcers watching everything with reptilian patience. I kept my head down, paid my fees, answered no questions, and boarded the transport before I could change my mind, before the gravity of what I was doing could pull me back to the sand. The ship lifted. I felt it in my stomach, the lurch and climb as we broke atmosphere, and I made the mistake of looking out a viewport as Tatooine fell away beneath us, shrinking from a world to a sphere to a point of light, ochre, and barren, and poisonous. From orbit, it looked almost beautiful. Looked like the kind of planet you might want to visit if you didn't know better. If you didn't understand that beauty from a distance was just another form of deception. I watched it disappear behind us as we jumped to hyperspace, and I felt nothing, no relief or sadness or triumph, just a flatness that I recognized from the morning I killed my first Tusken, the sense of crossing a threshold and finding nothing on the other side. The transport took me to the core worlds, to Coruscant, to the planet city where I thought opportunity lived. I was wrong. The core worlds had no use for moisture farmers, No place for people whose skills involved coaxing water from air and repairing ancient machinery with improvised parts. I found work in the lower levels, the industrial sectors where the sun never reached, and the air tasted like recycled exhaust, moving crates and cleaning equipment, and doing the kind of labor that machines could do better, but that cost less when performed by desperate people, willing to work for subsistence wages. The irony was not lost on me. I had left Tatooine to escape poverty and isolation and slow death by attrition, and I had found all three in abundance on the wealthiest planet in the galaxy, just in a different form, with better lighting and more people watching me die. I lived in a compartment barely large enough for a cot and a small storage locker, shared sanitation facilities with 200 other workers, ate processed food that tasted like nothing, and sent messages to the Lars family that went unanswered because I'd given them an address that probably didn't work, or because they'd given them an address that probably didn't work, or because they'd decided that I was another person. The city was full of people, millions upon millions pressed together in vertical kilometers of habitation and commerce, and I had never felt more alone. On Tatooine, isolation was a function of distance and environment. On Coruscant, isolation was a function of density, of being surrounded by so many people that you became invisible, interchangeable, a unit of labor that could be replaced with minimal disruption. I think about water more than I used to. On Tatooine, water was survival, was currency, was the fundamental scarcity around which all life organized. On Coruscant, water comes from taps, unlimited and unearned, and people waste it hot, leave it running while they wash, use it to clean things that don't need cleaning, consume it without thought or measurement. I find this obscene in a way I cannot articulate. This casual abundance, this thoughtless waste of the resource that defined my entire childhood. I have seen people on Coruscant complain about water quality, about taste and temperature and mineral content, and I have wanted to grab them and show them what real water scarcity looks like, what it means to calculate your family's survival in milliliters. But I don't, because they would not understand, because we are speaking different languages, because poverty and privilege create separate realities that cannot communicate across the gap. The Empire is more visible here, more present. Stormtroopers on every corner, Imperial propaganda on every screen, the constant sense that you are being watched and cataloged and assessed for loyalty. The Emperor's face looks down from banners and holos, an old man with yellow eyes who speaks about order and security and the necessity of sacrifice. And the crowds cheer because what else can they do? Because dissent means disappearance, means re-education camps or prison worlds, or simply vanishing into the machinery of state power and never returning. I hear people in the lower levels talk about the rebellion sometimes, in whispers and code words, the way people talk about dangerous ideas that could get you killed if the wrong person overhears. I think about those rebels who came to our homestead, who asked for help and were turned away, and I wonder if they were still fighting, still believing that resistance matters, still operating under the assumption that the galaxy can be changed through organized violence and ideological commitment. I don't believe that anymore. If I ever did, the galaxy is too large, too complex, too invested in its own continuation to be altered by individual action or even collective action. The Empire will fall eventually. All empires fall, but it will be replaced by something else, some other structure of power and exploitation, and the people at the bottom will continue to struggle and suffer and die, because that is what the bottom is for. That is its function in the machinery of civilization. We are the components that fail first, that absorb the stress and the damage so that the essential systems can continue operating. That was true on Tatooine, and it's true on Coruscant, and it would be true anywhere else in the galaxy because the math is the same regardless of location. Resources are finite, people are expendable, and the equation always resolves in favor of power. I got sick 3 months after arriving on Coruscant. Something respiratory, something that started as a cough and progressed to fever and chills and a pain in my chest that felt like broken glass. I couldn't afford medical treatment. The insurance provided by my employer covered catastrophic injury but not illness, not the kind of chronic conditions that accumulate from breathing recycled air and working in industrial facilities without proper environmental controls. I wrote it out in my compartment, alone, shaking with fever and coughing until I tasted blood. And I thought about my father, about his final morning walking between the vaporators, about how he died doing maintenance, and I realized that I was going to die the same way, just in a different location, killed not by sand and heat but by neglect and industrial capitalism, and the same fundamental arithmetic that said my life had value only if I didn't die. The illness broke after 6 days, left me weak and shaking but alive, and I went back to work because missing work meant losing the job, and losing the job and losing the job meant homelessness, and homelessness on Coruscant meant death, slower perhaps than on Tatooine, but just as certain. I moved crates, I cleaned equipment, I did my job with the mechanical efficiency my father had taught me, and I felt nothing, no satisfaction, or resentment, or hope, just the flat continuation of existence, for its own sake, because stopping required a decision, and I was too tired to make decisions. The dreams started after that. Not nightmares exactly, but repetitions. The same sensory images cycling through my sleep. The smell of ozone and moisture, the sound of vaporators humming their eternal hymn, the feel of sand between my fingers, the weight of the twin suns on the back of my neck. I would wake up disoriented, expecting to be underground in the homestead's cool darkness, and instead, I'd be in the compartment on Coruscant, with its artificial lights and recycled air, and the constant background noise of millions of people living in vertical proximity. The dreams felt more real than my waking life, felt like the truth I'd left behind, and I started to understand that leaving Tatooine had not been an escape but a relocation, that I'd carried the desert with me, internalized it, become the thing I'd been trying to flee. I met people in the lower levels who'd come from other Outer Rim worlds, other forgotten places where the Empire's reach was theoretical, and the local powers filled the vacuum with cruelty and exploitation. They'd come to Coruscant for the same reasons I had, believing the propaganda about opportunity and advancement, about how hard work and loyalty would be rewarded with security and prosperity. They found the same trap I'd found, that the core worlds needed workers, but did not value them, that we were useful only as long as we accepted whatever conditions were offered, and that the moment we broke down or questioned or demanded better, we were replaceable. We traded the visible oppression of the Outer Rim for the invisible oppression of the core, and the only difference was the packaging. One of them, a Twi'lek woman named Ree who'd come from Ryloth to escape the slave trade, told me that the galaxy was built on places like Tatooine and Ryloth, that the core world's wealth required the Outer Rim's poverty, that you couldn't have civilization without extraction zones, places and people designated as resources to be consumed. She said the Empire understood this, that the Emperor's rhetoric about order and security was just a cover for the same economic logic that had always governed galactic civilization. Those with power take from those without, and the mechanisms of state exist to enforce that relationship. She said the rebellion was fighting the wrong enemy, that overthrowing the Empire wouldn't change the underlying structure, wouldn't alter the mathematics of exploitation that made civilizations possible. Then she disappeared, arrested or relocated or simply ground up by the machinery of the lower levels, and I never learned which. I think about Luke Skywalker sometimes, that kid from the Lars farm who had his head full of dreams about leaving. I wonder if he made it off-world, if he found his academy or his adventure, or whatever he was looking for when he stared at the twin sunset and wished for somewhere else. I wonder if he discovered what I discovered, that leaving solves nothing, that the problems follow you because they're not located in the place but in the structure, in the fundamental organization of power and resources that treats people like components, like extractable value. Or maybe he's still on Tatooine, still maintaining vaporators for the family that took him in, having learned that dreams are luxuries, and that survival is the only achievement that matters. Or maybe he's dead, killed by Tuskens or equipment failure, or simple bad luck, another disappeared person whose absence changes nothing. The work on Coruscant is killing me slower than the work on Tatooine would have, but it's killing me just as certainly. My hands shake now. A tremor I can't control, the same tremor my father had in his final year. My lungs have never fully recovered from the illness, and I cough sometimes in the dry industrial air, taste metal and dust that reminds me of sand, even though there's no sand here. just particulate from manufacturing processes and recycled atmosphere. I'm 24 years old and I feel 60, feel used up, feel like a machine that's been run past its operational lifespan and is now experiencing cascading failures. I understand now what my father understood, that maintenance is all we have, that the work continues until it doesn't, and that there's a dignity in simply lasting, in extracting one more day from systems that want you to fail. The stars look different from Coruscant than they did from Tatooine. On Tatooine, the stars were sharp and clear, uncountable points of light that suggested infinite possibility, infinite distance, infinite escape. On Coruscant, the stars are dimmed by light pollution and atmospheric haze, visible only as a faint glow that might be stars, or might be orbital traffic, or might be reflections from the upper level's illumination. They've lost their promise, their suggestion of elsewhere. They're just another background element, ignored by everyone who was born here, and forgotten by everyone who came here. I used to look at the stars and feel longing. Now I look at them and feel nothing. There are rumors of a superweapon, whispers in the lower levels about something the Empire is building. A space station large enough to destroy planets. A demonstration of power so absolute that resistance becomes unthinkable. People talk about it the way they talk about natural disasters, with a kind of fatalistic acceptanza. Of course, the Empire is building something terrible. Of course, they would create a weapon that can obliterate worlds. Of course, the response to rebellion is not negotiation but annihilation. I hear these rumors, and I think about Tatooine, about that useless ball of sand and heat, and I wonder if the Empire would waste a planet-destroying weapon on a world that's already dead, that serves no strategic purpose, that exists only as a place for people to die slowly. Probably not. Tatooine isn't worth destroying because it's already destroyed, has been destroyed for millennia, is in a state of permanent destruction that requires no intervention. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Tatooine and places like it are the weapon, are the Empire's real instrument of control. You don't need planet-destroying space stations when you have economic structures that do the same thing over decades instead of seconds, that grind people down until they're too exhausted to resist, too broken to imagine alternatives, too desperate to do anything but accept whatever conditions are offered. You don't need stormtroopers on every planet when poverty and isolation and hopelessness do the work of occupation more efficiently and more completely. The Empire rules the Outer Rim not through military force, but through calculated neglect, through the withdrawal of resources and infrastructure and attention, through the creation of conditions that make survival itself a full-time occupation that leaves no energy for resistance. I dream about water still, about the cool darkness of the hydroponics bay, about my mother's plants with their white flowers and honey scent, about the moment when you check a vaporator and find that overnight the yield had been good, that the moisture front had come through, that today at least you would have enough. I dream about the girl from the trading post, wonder if she made it off-world, if she found what she was looking for, if she discovered that leaving was the answer, or just another version of the question. I dream about my father's hands, shaking as they tightened seals and replaced filters, maintaining systems that were failing, buying time that had no value, doing the work because the work was all there was. I think I understand now what Tatooine was teaching us, what the twin suns and the sand and the dying vaporators were trying to communicate, that nothing grows, that everything is maintenance and decay, that survival is not triumph, but simply delayed failure, and that the best we can hope for is to last long enough to see the sunset one more time, to feel the temperature drop and the heat relent, and the brief mercy of darkness before the sun's rise again, and the hulu. That's not despair. Despair would require the belief that things should be different. That's just recognition, acceptance, the clear-eyed acknowledgement of what we are, and where we are, and what the universe requires from us. The binary sunset was beautiful, I suppose, in its way. The twin suns sinking together, painting the sky in colors that looked like fire and blood and something older than names. But beauty doesn't change the equation. Beauty doesn't make water appear in an empty aquifer. Beauty doesn't repair failing equipment or resurrect dead moisture farmers, or offer escape from the arithmetic of survival. Beauty is just another sense impression, another piece of data, another thing the universe does without intention or concern for whether anyone is watching. I'm still alive. That's not an achievement, just a status report. I'm still working, still breathing, still converting my existence into labor that enriches systems I will never benefit from. I lasted longer than my father did, but not by much, and not in any way that matters. The shaking in my hands is worse now. The cough is constant. Malfunctioning. The exhaustion is a weight I carry everywhere, pressed down on my shoulders like the Tatooine heat, reminding me that I am failing, that the machinery is breaking down, that maintenance can only delay the inevitable for so long. Sometimes I think about going back. Not to Tatooine specifically, The homestead is gone, sold, probably already stripped by Jawas, or buried by sandstorms, but to the idea of Tatooine, to a place where the struggle is visible and simple, where you know exactly what you're fighting and why, where survival is measured in liters, and the enemy is heat and sand rather than invisible economic structures and political systems too large to come. But I know that's just another version of the dream, another fantasy of elsewhere, another belief that location matters when the truth is that the machinery exists everywhere, just in different configurations, just with different aesthetics. The truth about life on Tatooine, the grim truth, the one that the twin suns and the sand and the dying vaporators taught me, that nothing grows. Not crops, not hope, not people. We extracted what we could from systems designed to fail. We maintained equipment that was already obsolete. We fought battles we'd already lost, and we called it survival because survival was all we had. And when we died, the sand covered us, and the vaporators ran until they didn't, and someone else took our place in the machinery, and the galaxy continued without noticing the absence. That's the truth about Tatooine. That's the truth about Coruscant. That's the truth about everywhere in this galaxy where people struggle and suffer and die, so that other people can live in comfort, so that the core worlds can have water that falls from taps and food, that appears on demand and peace that is purchased with other people's oppression. We are the cost of civilization. We are the price that's paid so that someone else can look at stars and see possibility instead of just burning spheres of fusion that will outlast everything we build and everything we are. I remember the smell of ozone and moisture, the sound of vaporators humming, the weight of twin suns on the back of my neck. I remember my father's shaking hands, and my mother's flowers, and the girl who wanted to leave, and the boy who dreamed of flying. I remember all of it with the clarity of someone who knows they are dying, who has time to see their life reduced to essential images, to the sensory details that define their existence. And I remember the lesson, the one that Tatooine taught everyone who tried to make a life in that emptiness. That nothing grows, that maintenance is all we have, that the work continues until it doesn't, and that when the twin suns finally set and don't rise again, the universe will not pause or mourn or notice. Because we were never meant to thrive, only to last, and we fulfilled that purpose exactly as long as we were. The moisture vaporators are still running somewhere, I imagine. Still humming their hymn to futility, still extracting water from air, still maintained by someone who hasn't learned yet that they're already dead, that the equation has no solution, that nothing grows in the sand except the understanding that nothing was ever meant to grow there at all. That understanding is all I have left. That, and the memory